Parenting is a challenge, and most of us are learning as we go.
Dad Guild is here to help us find our way on this journey.
Our mission is to support and empower anyone who identifies as a father
by offering opportunities for connection,
education,
and community engagement. Everyone's parenting needs are unique.
We know we don't have all the answers,
but we believe in the power of community.
We invite you to join us as we share our stories and learn from one another.
This is Modern Pop.
Hey, welcome to the first episode of Modern Pop, a Dad Guild podcast. This is a project that's been in the works for about a year now. Mm-hmm. It's been a while. We were trying to get it going, but then, there's a pandemic going on. So that combined with, folks who are working on this podcast, having their paying jobs and trying to balance work-life stuff and raise children. And then kids getting...
And our non-paying jobs, too.
Yeah.
The side gigs.
Yeah. And then our kids, getting sick and can't be at school. It's just, man, if you have been raising children over the past 2 years, you get it. You get it. So it's been challenging. But here we are. I'm super stoked to be sitting here starting this podcast. And for those of you who don't know about Dad Guild, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that was founded in March of 2019. It's been 3 years, 2 of which have been in a pandemic, which is just kind of mind blowing. Yeah. It's been, oh man, it's been a couple of years. But we started out as a kind of a loose group of, dads, Facebook group meeting at playgrounds and stuff, and what started off as a couple dozen dads has now grown to a network of nearly 600 fathers of young kids throughout the state of Vermont. As far as I know, we have folks from 5 or 6 different counties, although primarily we are based out of Chittenden County, just because of our capacity. But yeah, we've done a lot of work, a lot of programs just to really engage fathers and, encourage non-birth partners to be involved in their parenting roles. And I'm really excited for this project and what's coming up next. And just kind of before we get started, a huge shout out to our friends at the Vermont Community Foundation who were generous to plant us some seed money to get this podcast going. So just so appreciative of their support of the work that we're doing. And hopefully they listen to this and they're like, oh, okay, that was worth the investment.
And what are we trying to do with this podcast?
So this podcast is, as I said, we've grown to a network of nearly 600 dads. In terms of folks who are, coming out to events, roughly I think of the 600-ish that I see on the list, probably have met a quarter, probably a third to a quarter of the folks. And so recognizing there's still a lot of folks who are, there are barriers to participation, whether it's scheduling, whether it's geographic location, whether it's some folks have identified social anxiety as a reason that they don't attend events. And so we talked about how can we build community? How can we share resources? How can we really, normalize dads talking about being a dad, what they're experiencing, the pros and the cons, the good and the bad. How can we ensure that in-person participation in our events is not a barrier to feeling connected to the community and hearing dads talk about dad topics? So this has been part of our, efforts to strengthen our community and make people feel connected and hopefully continue to grow it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to put in there is that, Dad Guild exists because of the people who come out and are involved and building that community. And I think one of our goals for this podcast is that it's not just the 3 of us, who will introduce ourselves in a second, talking, but that we really have the voices of the community present, because one of the best things about the events we have and the thing we want to share is all of those connections and all those voices is hearing from everyone who's involved, hearing their stories, hearing their struggles, talking to one another. And so we want the podcast to really do that too, to really be representative of our community, include everyone's voices.
Yeah, and I think there's a piece there too where normalizing that we're all figuring this out together. We're all yeah, we're, Dad Guild. We're sitting here in front of microphones talking on this podcast, but by no means does that make us experts. I'm raising 2 daughters, and I am messing up a lot. learning as I go and making mistakes. Hopefully, reflecting on those mistakes and, just learning through experience.
So that's a good segue. So let's introduce our hosts.
I guess that makes sense.
So why don't you who are you? Go first. You go.
So I'm Keegan Alba. I'm the executive director of Dad Guild. I live in Burlington with my family, my partner Stephanie, and I have 2 children, Coraline and Penelope. So yeah, that's who I am. I'm going to pass it to someone else.
Yep. I'm Marlon Fisher. I am the treasurer of Dad Guild. I am the father of 2 boys who are 5 and 4, Percy and Malachi, and I also live in Burlington.
And I am Nicholas Kramer. I'm the president of the board of Dad Guild as of a couple months ago. And I also have 2 boys. They are 4 and almost 1, just a couple weeks away from 1. And I also live in Burlington. And so, yeah, let's get into tonight's topic. Tonight, we are going to be talking about what it's like to become a father.
So, as we all know, becoming a father is a huge change in not just your life, but many of our lives. And unlike our partners, we didn't experience it until it was literally happening in front of us. What was that like? What turned out to be way different than you anticipated? How did you cope with that life-changing moment? And these are some of the questions that we're asking to you, our listeners, and to each other as we navigate this world of becoming a father. I mean, for me, everything was planned to a T in terms of when we were gonna have a kid and get pregnant and so on and so forth. So, for one is when you are having sex to make a baby is way different than when you're having just regular sex, right? So it's like there's so much pressure. Like normally, like, oh yeah, I could finish in 2 minutes, and here you are trying to make a baby. Like the thought on your mind is like, I can't do this. What are we doing? So. That's the first part, because that's part of becoming a father, right? It's like I'm not just having sex for pleasure; I'm having sex to make a baby, and it's way different.
Well, for me, the second time was not fun.
Right.
The first time was fine. I mean, I think we were trying, but not like as badly as the first time,
right.
Or the second round. The second time was like, it took us like 1.5 years the second time, and it like that got old. Like, that was the worst.
Well, I think about that, like that piece around trying to have a kid, where I think ingrained into my head, it's always just like use protection and like you don't want, make sure you're ready to have a kid. And for me, I think I definitely had this thought that like, oh, once we're ready and your partner is off birth control or you stop using condoms, that like it's just gonna happen really quickly. But that process, like the actual act of how one becomes a parent can look so different for so many people. I mean, for some folks it's unplanned and it just happens. For some folks, they make a decision to try and it happens. For some folks it is 1.5 years or much longer, and it becomes this incredibly stressful situation that's
and
also
potentially expensive.
Expensive if you're in a privileged place to be able to afford that. It can be really expensive and also like heartbreaking, with like a lot of folks experienced loss during this. During the process, and that's really stressful. Some folks use donors or have surrogates, and like it's just really interesting. And some folks like who end up in parenting or caregiving roles, and maybe it's a grandparent or an aunt or uncle, someone who like wasn't actively thinking about wanting to be a parent, and due to whatever circumstances they've been put into that position, and now they're taking care of a baby. And like there are so many different journeys or paths that people can go to to end up in this position, you know, as a dad or as a caregiver, that it's not just like this one way, and it's everyone's experience is like can be very unique and just have a lot of emotions and traumas potentially, and sadnesses and joys and happinesses associated with it.
Yeah, I hadn't, when we, I think, came up with this topic, I don't think I was thinking about like that difference of how much like the journey to get there changes it. What's weird as I'm saying that is that I was thinking about like the difference in the journey from being like a non-birth parent versus being like a birth mother or like a birthing parent. Like that difference is big, right? Because you're not physically connected to this child for like 9 months, right? Like that's a huge difference, right? And you don't like, you're like, yeah, it's coming, like, oh yeah, I can like maybe feel it kick or something like every once in a while, but I'm not like constantly, like my body is not affected by it. I'm just like kind of out on the side. And then until that moment when you're like, oh, now I'm actually holding this thing, this baby that's like a real being that I have, like I can touch and I can hold it and I can connect with it like physically. Right. Suddenly, like at the end of this like long journey to get there, you know.
But you are impacted mentally and emotionally with your partner carrying this child, like those those moments as they hit the different stages of the pregnancy. You know, you go from, you know, them having a hard time sleeping to being uncomfortable, and you have to figure out like how you comfort them, and then that takes, I'm not saying it takes a toll, but has some impact on you in terms of how you respond and react, because all you want to do is make sure that they're comfortable, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes, like, some people, you know, can be selfish, right? Like, oh man, now you're cutting into my, you know, you think of some young parents who like are young dads who play video games, like, oh, you're taking away from my video time, or you're taking away from me going to hang out with someone. So then, and that becomes the reality when you have a kid, where you actually don't have time to do any of those things.
I saw a tweet last week that was like, as an adult with no kids, I feel it's my responsibility to do all the things that that the people who've decided to raise the next generation aren't going to be able to do. So I'm just going to vibe and chill and do fun things all the time.
Yeah.
And I was like, yep, you do that.
Yeah, I was just thinking, so like our first, just that part about, you know, becoming a parent, that transitioning into that, because like that pre-parent lifestyle, man, I wasted so much time. I slept until like 11 a.m. on weekends and just like lay around and watch TV and like put off, like I was able to like do so little in like so much free time. I look back, I'm like, oh my gosh, if I get like 5 minutes to myself now, like days, if I'm able to like go to the bathroom with the door shut and not be bothered for 5 minutes, it's like, wow, that's huge. And I look back to before when I was playing lots of video games, and just like, again, wasting lots of time or using time in a different way. It's just like, it's so different. And the other, I was remembering too, talking about, you know, that journey to becoming a parent or a father, that like, you know, when my partner and I decided to try to have kids, like our first like pregnancy ended in loss. We had a miscarriage, and just like I remember like that whole experience, and then when my partner got pregnant the second time, I remember just feeling like, oh, I'm excited but nervously excited, because we're both just like so anxious and nervous that this pregnancy is also going to end in loss, and just being nervous the whole time. And then, you know, the baby, it's longer, you know, it's going beyond when the previous loss happened, and you're kind of getting more excited, and you're like, man, at what point can I just stop worrying and just be excited about this? And then I was, you know, and then like, but then you're worried the whole time, the whole pregnancy, because you're just like, stuff can happen, and you hear stories, and then you get up to the birth, and you're like, oh my gosh, there's so much, you know, I'm just trying to think about, and of course I'm going to worry, but like, yeah, once this kid comes out, I'm going to stop worrying, because then the baby's going to be here. And then I remember like when our first daughter, Coraline, was born, and like that, when she came, you know, when she was born into the world, and just like looking at her and holding her, and just like all of a sudden this sudden realization that it was just like, oh, you're actually gonna worry for the rest of your life. It's not like, oh, your kid's born, you're gonna stop worrying. It's like, hey, your kid's born. Welcome to worrying about this human being for the entire rest of your existence. And you're like, okay, so now that thing is, for me, that was a big understanding of like becoming a parent, was that like there is a large chunk of my brain that is always dedicated to thinking and worrying and being concerned about these small humans that I'm now responsible for keeping alive and developing into, contributing, thoughtful, empathetic, funny community members.
Right.
Yeah, I totally see that. For me, it wasn't like, I definitely felt that we also, for the second round, we also had a pregnancy that didn't go all the way. And that definitely colored that one, like with the second kid, of like, this could be, we could be starting over again, like anytime. And we were pretty much like, we were like, if this last one doesn't go, like, we're done. Like, we're not going to keep trying. And then it did. So it was like very up and down with that one. Mm-hmm. The first time though, like, I don't know, I'm very like laid back about stuff. So I was just kind of like, yeah, I don't know, it'll be a thing. Like, I don't really know. And like, I just kind of avoided thinking about it until it was like happening. Mm. And then I think the thing that struck me more than anything was just the sleep, the like not sleeping, and really not, actually, this is in one, can I give you guys a preview of what's in one of the things?
Okay.
I forget who, but one of the other people has a thing about, it's not sleeping, it's being woken up constantly. And I remember having that realization of like, oh, I'm not going to wake up naturally again for a very long time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, something is going to wake me up, either crying or being poked because I'm not hearing the crying, or an alarm because I have to get up to check to make sure that there is crying still. Like, something, like, just like, I don't think I'd ever experienced that kind of like sleep for 2 hours, wake up, sleep for 2 hours, wake up, sleep. Like,
I wanted to go back to the loss, and you talked about your first try miscarriage. I know you were trying. I didn't get to experience that, but I almost did, and that really changed a lot for me. Because one is, I think because of my military experience, I deal with loss differently. It just, like, my mindset is like, it happens, you move on, right? Mm-hmm. And when my first son was born, it was a hard birth. We were trying a natural birth. We went in for a C-section, and that C-section turned into an emergency C-section. And I wasn't allowed in the room because things had gone wrong, and pretty much what ended up happening, long story short, is that the epidural, right? Mm-hmm. The epidural traveled the wrong way and shut down my partner's lungs and heart.
Oh, geez.
And so they had to go to general anesthesia, which impacts the baby. And so when my firstborn son, he had a low APGAR score. I mean, he was born not alive. And so for the first half an hour, my sister-in-law, who's an OBGYN, she was like, something's not right. Like, you should be in that room, and like, I immediately went to that worry, the worry, but I also went back to the message that my wife had told me, like, if something happens, make sure you do skin to skin. So here I am, like, with my shirt off, ready for him to come. And, after a half an hour of reviving both of them, I was able to see Percy and bring him, and they brought him to the NICU because of, our water had broken, however long you need, your water breaks. But for me, that the loss of, the potential loss of that, something that I hadn't held yet, was really impactful. Especially the thought of, I might have to do this by myself, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you think back to like back in the day when women would give birth and like they would die after the birth, and like that's what my thought process was. I'm gonna have to do this by myself, and I think that motivated me because it was 4 days after that not even 4 days. It was she had a C-section, she almost died, and 2 days after that she walked out of the hospital with no painkillers, and that's the strength in like watching her, one, carry a baby, two, like give birth and die pretty much, and then walk out 2 days later with no pain meds. Like, yeah, that's a strong, like, first of all, people who give birth are strong, are very strong, and that's one thing. And the other part too is like I felt more committed to becoming being a caregiver and making sure that Percy lived his best life, which is why I was like, I'm not going to work. After 4 days of holding this kid who was not alive previously, 4 days earlier, I quit my job, and that was the big difference for me. Like, I was able to do something that I had never had as a kid, and really put all of my attention into raising Percy, for the first part of his life, which feels good because now we have this connection. So yeah, the worry piece, and that's when
Yeah, we had that. Ours wasn't as bad, but when my first one came out, he was like blue and like not breathing, and they had to go to the warming table, and we had agreed, like, my partner was like, if there's any problem, like, you go with the baby, like, you like, don't worry about me, you make sure the baby's okay, because I can't get up and be over there, right? So you have to go, right? We had planned that out. So like in the moment, like I wasn't expecting that to like happen. I was like, it's out. Oh no, what? Like, this other thing, like, and I hadn't even considered that as like a thing. Like, I kind of knew it was a possibility, but I hadn't thought about it really at all. And it was like, oh no, this is happening. Like, I got to go over here, and it was probably 3 minutes. Like, It wasn't that big a deal, but there was that like time slowing to nothing and standing there with all the yellow. The yellow crew.
Yellow, the doctors in yellow. What's also interesting about birth and like what we talk about, what we were expecting as parents, is that we spend 9 months preparing for a kid to come. Like, people, I would say people with privilege and like people with privilege and time, we spend 9 months preparing, right? So you're buying the crib, you're buying the clothes, you're going to classes.
Really, like 6 months.
Right. You're doing all, and it seems like a long time. It's not, because it happens so fast. But you're doing all these things, which not everyone is capable of doing. And then you have this plan, and the plan never goes as it's supposed to go, right? Like, the number one thing in my plan was just skin to skin. That was it, no matter what. But like, oh, we're gonna have this happen. We're gonna do a water birth. We're gonna do this. We're gonna do this. It never goes as planned, which is like the exact example of what parenting is like, right? We have all these plans for how we're going to talk to our kids and do all these things, but it never goes that way, ever. So like the giving birth is almost like the metaphor for what everything's going to be like, later on.
Just change.
Right.
Oh, that plan we had, that's gone. Let's throw that out the window.
Just be ready.
If you keep trying to hold on to it, it's just going to make it worse. Right. Like, let go quickly and go to the next thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly, too, that acknowledgement around, we talked about the journey about different people to becoming parents or caregivers and those roles, and how, a child can end up in your family in many different ways. And also acknowledge that piece around like people who do give birth, around like, man, like how amazing is that? Like I think about just like growing a human inside of you and like, carrying this small human, and then how that small human, comes out of your body, and just, I think it speaks to the strength of like, I stubbed my toe or something. I'm like, oh man, I'm like out for the long haul. And I'm like, whoa, your body just like, like a human,
right.
Like the ship came out of the bottle. Like how on earth did it even happen? Just speaks to the strength of those folks, and just acknowledging too that like, traditionally that's seen as like as women, and also recognizing like, there are folks who certainly identify as men whose bodies, are able to have a uterus and like are able to hold a child and develop and give birth, and just acknowledging that as well.
Yeah. I almost wrote a joke. I almost wrote a joke based off of this experience of my partner dying and walking out of the hospital 2 days later after a C-section. Because after that, like, I'm like, God, she is a really, like, women are strong, but like, whoa, like, this is crazy. And then, like, I see, then I would see like people post sometimes like, still in the hospital after my C-section. I'm like, you weak, but like, you're not weak, because like, that's really hard to go through. Your body just went through a trauma, but I think back to, like, again, like, I feel like she's sort of just like a superhero or whatever she did mentally to push her body. But yes, like, those things are really traumatic on the body. But like, the comedian in me, like, always wants to be like, oh, you spent 4 days in the hospital? You're weak. Like, but you're not. You're not weak. You're strong. You.
I have that same thing because Bonnie, no drugs either time.
Oh.
No stitches
Wow.
either time.
Right.
So like, absolute perfect,
Right.
like, way it could have gone, basically. Like, and that's what she wanted.
Right.
So it was like, and I kept being like, we're gonna talk to the anesthesiologist, because if you do need it, like we're gonna, the doula and I were like, we're gonna make sure that if you don't want it, we're gonna help you make that decision, right? But like, I'm like, we're in a hospital
Right.
for a reason.
Yeah.
So like, let's make sure that we can take full advantage of the hospital just in case we need it.
And there's such a parallel there, I think, to just parenting or raising children in general, where that piece around, like, because I feel like in today's world there's a lot of like how comparing to one another, and like there's, especially as kids get older, there's like this like kind of like unspoken competition where like, how's everyone doing, and that piece around like giving birth around and it's this line of like celebrating wow, this person's so strong, and also acknowledging that, like, gosh, it just happens in so many different ways, and like like we were talking about how things shift in the hospital or wherever, or at a home birth or wherever one gives birth to a child, that like things can shift and the playbook can be rewritten, and having all these audibles and whatnot, and that however that process looks, or like it's okay, like
Yeah.
and to like, because I think I've heard folks around that, like, like, hey, I'm so proud of my partner, and like, how strong she was, and it's just like amazing to look, like, to this day I look at her and I'm like, man, like, I can't believe what you did, and like, how fast that was, and all these things, while also like not wanting to contribute to this like comparative, like, piece that sometimes like becomes pretty pervasive, I think, in parenting around like, how quick, like, how early is your kid reading a book, or like, are they riding a bike, or like, are they doing these things, and just being accepting that, like, hey, what kind of like caregiving community do I want to foster the development of or be a part of, and it's one that like accepts everyone and like recognizes there's so many different paths and journeys and ways to get from point A to point B, and that like so many of them are like totally fine and okay, and being accepting.
Well, yeah,
of
and
one another.
I think that, like, related to like the same story, like, it's not like better, like, it's almost on some level like the more, like, it can be very traumatic, like giving birth, right? Almost like the more traumatic it is, like the
Right.
more strength it is, even though there's sort of this like positive or thing around, oh, it's less traumatic, or like, what is trauma, like, what some people would rather have a C-section than actually like deal,
Right.
than go through like whatever the alternative is, like, so I think it's really just the person and how, and their own, it's like, it's all relative, right? Trauma is relative, and to like what you wanted, what you didn't want, and how it actually went, and like what that involved. And on some level, like, birth is impressive and traumatic, however it goes, like whether it goes to plan and whatever your plan was, All right, let's hear a call from Kendall Fortney. I hope I'm saying that right. Here we go.
Fatherhood was a complicated journey for me. I found out my partner was unexpectedly pregnant, despite birth control, 2 days after my father died suddenly of cancer. I never had a drive to be a father, nor did I want to become one at the time. While we did not initially agree, my partner and I worked together as I found a path to choosing to be a dad. I was lucky to have a partner willing to give me space when I needed it and listen to when I was ready to talk, and a close friend when I needed just to let out some of the stress. I was transparent with my friends about the complexity of having a kid, but it was difficult to navigate everyone expecting me to be so excited about a coming child when sometimes I would just feel dread. In the months leading up to the birth, we moved in together and started building our new lives. In January of 2020, my wonderful daughter was born. My mother got to see her first and only grandchild, and I learned how precious sleep was on my paid paternity leave. I started to get into a routine that almost felt normal. And then, 2 months later, COVID forced us into lockdown. Instantly, we lost all the support and social escapes that had helped us feel normal. I was stuck working out of my dark basement through the winter and into the spring, never leaving the house with a screaming infant above me as I did Zoom call after Zoom call. My partner lost her job and we both struggled with health issues produced by stress and anxiety of the situation, but thankfully never got COVID. The days blurred into nights and back into days, and I did not so much as cope as just survive, one foot in front of another. With summer brought light warmth and times outdoors. At that point she was crawling, smiling, giggling, and I started to come to terms with my new role, enjoying my time watching her grow and be part of her life. In reality, it took the better part of a year for me to really become a dad. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I'm grateful. A friend recently found himself in the same situation, a reluctant father for an unexpected child. I was grateful that I could share with him my journey, struggle, and help him work through his choice to be a dad as well. I have now gotten to see him with his 3-week-old son in his arms and a smile on his face. It was worth it.
Oh, man.
I think one of the things that struck me about this, and I think building on the different journeys, unplanned, planned, and then your plans don't turn out the way you planned to plan it. That kind of happened to me a little bit. But I think the idea that everyone is like, oh, you should be excited about this, and then maybe not feeling excited about it. I mean, even if you did plan it, there's that moment of like loss in that, like, I don't have 7 hours to spend. I'm not going to have 7 hours to spend. Like, oh, all of these things, like, am I young anymore? Like, am I hip? Can I still, like, who am I if now that I'm this new thing, or that I have to be this new thing, or like the ball's rolling, like I'm it, right? Like I'm a father now. What does that mean? And there's a certain like loss associated with that. And so, like, even if it is the most happy thing ever, there's this change that happens, right? And I think it's probably more common than not for people to have that feeling, and it's probably mixed up, like with happiness. I mean, it could be, a lot more in one direction or the other, but I think it's there for almost everyone, that there's that like, oh man, like I'm supposed to be really happy about it, and I don't really know. Like, I don't know if I know how I feel about this. Like, I feel so many different things about it that it's hard to even like talk about it. Right. You know what I mean? And can I talk about some of these things? Like, what, who can I talk to those things about? Like, I feel like people are going to be upset if I'm not super happy. Like, I'm supposed to feel a certain way,
Yeah. I'm so appreciative of Kendall being vulnerable and sharing that, because I think that's something, where he was like talking about like feeling dread, Right. I think dread was the word, like feeling dread of becoming a dad. And normalizing that, like, that doesn't make you a monster. It doesn't make you awful. Doesn't make you a bad person. Doesn't make you a bad parent. Doesn't, all these things. It's like, that is, feelings of that are totally normal and totally valid. It's like you were just saying, like, all these things that, like, your life changes completely. All these things that, like, that shift. It's a big change. And then, like, and if that wasn't in your plan, or even if it was in your plan, or like, I think about, like, even like after having a kid, like, you have those moments where like your kid's screaming in the middle of the night and you're running on so few sleep, you're fighting with your partner, like there's work, like there's just like, there's so much going on that of course you have those moments of like, what the F am I even doing? Like, why am I doing this? Like, I regret this. I'm so annoyed. I just want to run away right now. I can't handle this. And I think that, like, sometimes, especially on social media, sometimes like we really like glorify, I think sometimes like parenting and like, look, everyone's smiling all the time and this is great.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, you're sharing maybe your best moments, but like, man, there's some like not great parts of it where our minds go to different places. And I mean, like I say, we all do that, but like I think most of us do that. And so I appreciate those. I appreciate when people take moments to like be honest and share that, because that like that story that Kendall shared, that just has like such, I think that has such an impact on the larger community when we can just be real and be authentic and be like, hey, judgment aside, all this other things aside, I don't love this. I don't love this all the time. And like really normalizing that. And just to hear Kendall also end with like, and I had, you know, even in like his own personal network, he found there was another guy who was going through the same thing, and to be like, to share that and like, gosh, that's what a gift for that other gentleman. Like that's so awesome.
Right. I you know, just to Keegan's, I think about what you just said, right? So we're building this community, and I think what makes a strong community are people being vulnerable and authentic, like Kendall has been. I also think Kendall and his story that he shared is reflective to what a lot of families have gone through in the last several years. And what comes out to me is resiliency, right? So there was this struggle, there was this loss, great loss. So I'm going to consider like him finding out about having a child is another loss for him. So you have all this loss where you have to be, in order to make it through all of that, you have to be extremely resilient. And he came out on the other end to a place where his daughter was born, and boom, happiness, and he's like, this is worth it. And then gets hit with the pandemic again. Well, not again, but gets hit with a pandemic, where now he's raising a child in the pandemic, has a friend who is in a similar situation, but has the strength to support his friend in that. And I think, again, those journeys, so worth it. Those journeys we need to be resilient in that, and we learn to be resilient. I mean, I think that's what it is. We learn to be resilient in whatever's thrown at us, and that's why we get these challenges thrown at us. So,
just a quick shout out to all you folks who have been raising babies during the pandemic. Like, like we see you. Every time I meet a dad they have a new baby, or the baby was born, you know, shortly before March 2020 or shortly after, or anywhere in between, like, you know, at some point during the pandemic, I'm just like, oh man, I can't imagine, like, were you still getting the meal trains? You know, were you able to like go on walks and go, like, you know, I just think about those times where you're like, man, I'm just like at home, you know, when Kendall was sharing, being in a Zoom meeting and there's an infant like crying upstairs, and like your mind can go to like not great places, in the like how important it was for us to be like, all right, let's just like go to Target, you know, and like, or like, let's go to the grocery store, let's go wherever, and just put the kid in and just walk around. It's like, oh, you couldn't do that. You couldn't do that. You couldn't have someone come over and watch the kid for a bit while you know, went out. Like, you didn't have like all these things about, you know, it takes a village. You didn't have your village in like physically in person. In that, I'm just like, to all you folks who have been raising tiny humans and becoming parents during this pandemic, like, oh man, like you are some strong
resilient
people. Resilient. You are resilient. Yeah. You are resilient folks. Like, keep it up.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank everybody for listening, and if the stories that we heard today, the stories that the host told today, like, resonate with you, if you got a story that's similar, that's different, if you have a story that we didn't talk about at all, you're like yelling at your smart home speaker, oh, I have a different experience, like, we would love to hear from you. We would love for you to be part of the podcast, right? Like, this podcast is supposed to be representative of our community, and we want our community to have voices on the podcast. So you can participate by calling us up and leaving us a message. The number you can call is 802-318-4231. Just call up, leave a message. You might want to say like, hey, this is for the podcast, so that we know specifically. It has a 3-minute time limit, so, you know, be succinct. You can also record a voice memo on your phone or on a computer or something and just email the file to podcast@dadguild.org, and we can get it that way. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you, and we'll, play it on the show and talk to you.
And just to jump on that, as we all saw or listened and heard Kendall share his story, and and then the impact that potentially had on his friend, this other dad who was in a similar situation. That's just one person. I think it's so important in terms of building community and normalizing, we're raising children and we're trying our best and we mess up a lot. But sometimes we don't feel great. Sometimes it's really funny. Sometimes it's hilarious and feels really good. That I think sharing all those stories is just super helpful for people to know that they don't feel alone. And particularly as men and as dads, that it's so important to, I think, those opportunities to model vulnerability or just talking about parenting. And I think in terms of storytelling, just any story that you share is a story that we want to hear. We just want to hear perspectives. And so, don't let the hang up that oh man, I don't have a great story. It's just anything. You can tell a story about getting your kids out to school one day, or a drawing that they brought home, or, holding your kid while they're crying, or a conflict that you had, or something funny, whatever. Those are all things worth normalizing dads talking about and sharing.
Modern Pop is produced by Dad Guild and hosted by Keegan Alba, Marlon Fisher, and Nicholas Kramer, and made possible thanks to the support of the Vermont Community Foundation. Editing and music by me, Nicholas Kramer. Special thanks to Kendall Fortney and all of our members and donors. For more information about our organization, check us out online at www.dadguild.org and follow us on Instagram @dadguild. If you have any questions or comments about the show or something you'd like to share with the community, reach out at podcast@dadguild.org. And remember, as caregivers, community is one of the most powerful tools any of us can leverage. This is Modern Pop.